Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome to our 10th class on Bhagavad Gita. We are picking up on the 8th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. We got to chapter 8, text 22. So we'll start from text 23. We'll finish the 8th chapter today and start the 9th chapter in one conversation with a French Navy admiral, I believe. Srila Prabhupada was asked, if I only have time to read one chapter, what should I read? And Srila Prabhupada said, read chapter 9. So pretty valuable chapter. Lots of really beautiful verses. I seriously doubt we'll get through all of it today, but we will have a lot of fun as far as we get. So without any further ado, we'll start with some Krishna Kirtan, some Nam Kirtan, headed by, I think, Kelly and the Burlington crew.
Jai.
Okay. So come into your comfortable seat. And just take a moment to notice what's joining you from your day, from your week thus far. Sit tall, and aligning your posture so it's in a place in which you're alert, you're aware, yet there's a softness, a receptivity. And find your breath. Let's take a deep breath in through the nose together, fill up. Open your mouth, exhale, let it go. Start with our opening prayers, this invocation, this honoring of all of our teachers, the acharyas, the saintly beings who have walked this path of yoga before us, bestowing the light of knowledge upon us, and extinguishing the darkness of ignorance. Take a deep breath in. Om Jnana-Timirandasya Jnananjana-Shalakaya Chakshunyatamyena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita
Wonderful. Hare Krishna. So picking up where we left off, last class we started from the beginning of the 8th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Attaining the Supreme. The 8th chapter began with the question that Krishna received from Arjuna at the end of the 7th chapter. Rather, Krishna brings up the topic of those who know me perfectly can know me even as the Supreme Lord at the time of death. And so Arjuna asks a series of questions. What is karma? What is the world? Does anybody remember, for example, how Krishna defines karma? It's in 8.3. I'll read it to you. I thought it was really interesting. Action pertaining to the development of the material bodies of the living entities. Anything that's done that develops the material bodies, the living entities, is called karma. So he asks these questions, and his last question is, how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death? And then Krishna talks about this cultivation of consciousness. We explored that, how life is an ongoing cultivation. And what we cultivate, where we place our heart, where we place our attention, that's where we go. Where attention goes, energy flows, right? In life and also afterlife. That's the basic function. And Krishna says, if you think of me, then you come to me. And yang vabi smaran bhavam tyajatyante kalevaram tam tam evaiti kaunteya siddhartha bhava bhavitaha. Verse 6, whatever you think of, whatever you're remembering, whatever's there in your heart, whenever you leave your body, then you go to that. So he says, therefore, Arjuna, you should do your duty, which for you means fighting. Do it as a service to me. Think of me throughout the performance of your duty and always remember me. And we heard about how to do that through abhyas practice, specifically in terms of hearing and chanting Krishna's names. Are there any other reflections from the last week of readings, from your own practice, anything that stood out, or from the discussion on WhatsApp? Anything that you found interesting about the time of death, about the cultivation of consciousness? Krishna also talks about the material world, verses 15 and 16, how they're coming and going. Let's have at least one reflection to start us off.
We got one from Melanie.
Great.
I loved how you said this at the very start of the last class, and then I've been just like really holding it really close for this whole week. And then when I was rereading, thinking about it, just how Arjuna just asks questions and how all of these teachings are really the result of the questions he's asking. And it just like is empowering me to ask questions and like to not just hold my questions inside and try to figure them out on my own. And just if you can, inquire from a place of sincerity, then you can learn. And so it's just really beautiful how this like whole Gita is based off of asking questions.
That's right. Yeah, that's a really good point. Krishna, he doesn't really insert himself. He's not like getting in Arjuna's space and saying, listen, you got your whole life backwards. This is how you got to live it. Arjuna organically comes to a place where he has questions and he asks them. So we've talked a lot about like this kind of function of life, that it offers these teachable moments where we realize I really need help. And then the other thing is like actually asking for it, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Basically, the whole Bhagavad Gita, as you point out, is basically Arjuna asking question after question. And sometimes he asks the same question more than once. Like chapters 3 and 5 are basically on the same topic because he's not even completely clear about it. And it's 2023 AD, and people are still classically like have so many questions about karma yoga. How is it that I can like act in the world and that's still spiritual? So just like Arjuna, they'll ask more than once, and that's okay. And that actually allows for the conversation to get richer and deeper. This is why in our bhakti movement, at least and the way I was exposed to bhakti and what really appeals to me, there always has to be a back and forth. I'm not into like didactic teaching where I'm like here, I'm the one with knowledge and I'll just talk at you, you know? There's some of that, like there's going to be some, transmission of knowledge, but it's all about like how receptive people are, and are they able to reflect on it, and do they have questions? So then we'll do that in class and beginning of the next class, and in WhatsApp, and the YouTube comments, and private messages to me or Kelly, and that's what it's all about, because it's actually personal. Every person here who's listening to this, live or recorded, is having a personal relationship with the 8th chapter, 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. And so where they're at in relationship to that is completely unique. And so it's not just not bad to ask questions. It's actually kind of the point. Yeah. Thank you. One of Srila Prabhupada's, a book that was made of a conversation between Srila Prabhupada and a future disciple. At that time was just a very curious young man. It's called Perfect Questions, Perfect Answers. Perfect questions, perfect answers. So you have to ask the right questions to get the best answers. Good. Any other reflections? Things that stood out from the 8th chapter, the first 2/3 of the 8th chapter, Eileen?
Well, I was just going to say it kind of carries through the last chapter into this chapter. And as you're talking about, what we're thinking of at our time of death, Leanne put in some reflections like, oh, this is why we have incense for smell, and we have the bell for hearing. And so that in all of our senses, we remember Krishna. And I had a conversation with a friend. We were kind of just talking about lifestyles and how to be more Krishna conscious. And I was talking about cleaning my house, and she's like, yeah, you're not cleaning your house for you. You're cleaning your house for Krishna, because it's a sacred place. And again, we know that, but it was so good to hear that again, because I think we forget it in like all the craziness. And so if, it's really, I guess, comforting to know that if we continue to try to see Krishna every time we taste that sip of water, or every time we see that flower, or we're cleaning our house or cooking our food, then it becomes more real that we would be able to think of him, at the time of death. So I think that's just a beautiful theme that's kind of carried through this chapter as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the cultivation at work. That it's not like a deathbed repentance. You don't sign a contract at the end and you're saved. It's really organic. It's like you get the privilege of deciding what you want to do with your human life, where you want to put your attention, and all that aggregates and it builds up in the heart. And Krishna is saying, you can go anywhere. So why not come to me? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Bhagavad Gita is a profoundly empowering text. The whole way, Krishna is giving power to Arjuna. He's acknowledging Arjuna's power, how he has agency over his life, and where he can go because of his choices. Because at the beginning, actually, Arjuna feels completely powerless. He feels like he has no choice. Everything's happening to him. Everything's bigger than him. He has no scope to like maneuver. And Krishna is actually basically saying, you have tremendous power. But that power really has to do with whether you choose to connect to me or not. Jai. All right. Anything else from the last chapter before we move into the last part of the first 8th chapter? Before we move into the rest? Okay. So then we heard a little bit about the material world, how it's temporary, and we don't actually belong here. We heard about the cycle of the ages a little bit, text 17 and 18 and 19, and how there is another aspect of reality, the unmanifest nature, which is eternal and isn't coming and going, and doesn't become annihilated or dissipated. So we got to text 22. So now picking up on chapter 8, text 23, Krishna starts talking about some of the technicalities of the yogic system around leaving the body at different times. He says, now I'll tell you the different times at which passing away from this world, the yogi does or does not come back. The idea being liberation from the material world, transcending means not having to come back, right? Maybe you choose to come back for service, but you don't have to. You're not actually bound to the wheel of time anymore. You're not bound to the wheel of karma. You're not forced to take birth again to experience some good or bad thing, some winning or losing, some auspicious or inauspicious situation. You're not forced to anymore. You're free. So Krishna is talking about how the yogi is trying to get free. And in the external practice of yoga, like the Ashtanga practice of yoga, the mechanical process of stilling the body and mind and focusing the mind outside of the material realm towards the Supreme, there are more and less auspicious ways of leaving the body. And then at the end of the chapter, I'm going to give you a little shortcut because the next few verses won't make sense otherwise. At the end, Krishna says, but if you're practicing bhakti, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you die in an auspicious way or in an inauspicious way. It doesn't matter if you leave your body during the day or the night or this season or that season. Because well, we'll see why. We'll see why the because. But first, text 24. Share my screen here. Agnir Jyotirah Shukla Sharmasa Uttarayanam Tatra Priyata Gachanti Brahma Vido Janaha. Those who know the Supreme Brahman, the Supreme, the Divine, attain that Supreme by passing away from the world during the influence of the fiery god, that's the sun, in the light at an auspicious moment of the day, during the fortnight of the waxing moon, or during the 6 months when the sun travels in the north. And then the mystic who passes away from this world during the smoke, the night, the fortnight of the waning moon, or the 6 months when the sun passes to the south, reaches the moon planet, but again comes back. This is an allusion to the Ashtanga system, which was practiced in previous ages by persons for long stretches of time, whereby they could, without necessarily having bhakti for Krishna directly, or at least not pure bhakti, they could become free from the world. But that depended on the strength of their practice, depended on how expert they were at focusing the mind and becoming free from the distractions of the world. So this system was practiced through, as was alluded earlier in this chapter, strict celibacy, solitude, that kind of thing, generally ranging over several lifetimes, actually. And it's kind of like self-directed. You have to be very perfect in your practice. And the idea is that when one is perfect in their practice, they can actually choose when to leave the body. They can choose when to leave the body, and they have to die at the right time. And the idea is that these are indications, in summary, that someone has left the body in a yogic practice successfully. Now, Krishna goes on from this place. From this point, he says, although the devotees know these two paths, O Arjuna, this is text 27, Naite Sruti Parthajanan Yogi Mukhyati Kashchana Tasmat Sarveshu Kaleshu Yoga Yukto Pavarjuna. Although the devotees know these two paths, O Arjuna, they are never bewildered. Therefore, be always fixed in devotion. From the purport, Krishna is here advising Arjuna that he should not be disturbed by the different paths that the soul can take when leaving the material world. A devotee of the Supreme Lord should not worry whether he will depart by arrangement or by accident. The devotee should be firmly established in Krishna consciousness and chant Hare Krishna. The idea here is that, on the contrary, with a spiritual path that's undertaken through our own power, that has to be successfully performed, we're not actually doing that in bhakti. In bhakti, it's described in the Srimad Bhagavatam, the graduate study to Bhagavad Gita, that bhakti is like being a child in the hand of your parent. It's described that even if you run with your eyes closed in bhakti, you cannot trip and fall because you're being held. You can imagine a child, right? Children run around all the time, get up to all kinds of trouble, go to all kinds of places. And can they fall down? Definitely they can fall down. But what happens if they're holding their parent's hand? They can't fall down, even if they don't have the best judgment, even if they make a mistake. Why? Because they're being maintained and protected by someone more powerful than them, who's aware and who cares. That's Krishna. That's what bhakti is. Bhakti means putting Krishna in charge, making him the captain of the ship, and following and being protected by that. In the mechanical process of Ashtanga, although there is some mix of bhakti there, after all, you're focusing on the Supreme, there's still the conception that I'm completely in control of my destiny and I have to be perfect in this. And these are like the absolute all-time greatest that control in the mind and senses, and they can become liberated if they're perfect in that. But in bhakti, it's not that we control our senses. We do our best, But the bhakti process means we're getting empowered to control our senses. We're getting help to bring the mind under control, to bring it towards Krishna, to think of him, to be attracted to him. That we're no longer alone in our spiritual progress. We're actually in a partnership. Krishna becomes our partner, takes us by the hand, and therefore, he's saying, the yogis don't worry about this. That's the point of these verses. The point of these verses is to bring out, it doesn't matter how you die, because you're not alone. And the advancing yogi, the advancing devotee, that is, realizes that throughout their life. And that's one of the meanings to one of the questions that came out last week of why does it have to be so hard? If Krishna wants us back to him, why does it have to be so hard? Well, one of the answers is that because when it's hard and we take more shelter of him and we come through the other side of some challenging situation, we realize we weren't alone. He was with us and he protected us through things that didn't make sense. And that's just training for leaving the body. And therefore, the devotee leaves completely fearlessly because they know by then that they're not alone. They've had that. They've become convinced of that. Krishna is maintaining them. The analogy that Srila Prabhupada gives is like that of a cat. You have a mother cat, right? Ever seen mother cats with their kittens? It's adorable. Got this little litter of kittens. They don't know what's going on. You know, they're like wandering around, bumping into things. And you have the mom. Mom picks up the little kitten by the scruff of the neck in the mouth, right? Carries it somewhere. So Srila Prabhupada describes that mother cat is like death. You see, if the mother cat catches a mouse, those same lips, fangs, or like teeth, that catches the mouse, that catches the kitten. If it catches the mouth, what is the experience of that mouse? Mortal terror, right? Absolute mortal terror. Because they're gonna die and they know it. As soon as they're in the jaws of the cat, their life is over. That's what it's like to leave your body. If you don't know who you are, if you don't know your connection to the Supreme. But that same mouth, those same teeth, gently pick up a kitten by the scruff of its neck and carry it to wherever it has to go. And the kitten's just along for the ride. Doesn't even know where it's going, doesn't care, but they know, Mama's protecting me, I'm fine. Same mouth. That's the death of the devotee. They're being carried. They're fearless. Oh, I don't know where I'm going, but Krishna's in control. Time to change a venue, shift a chapter. But I'm in your hands, Krishna, no problem. And so they have a free ride. They don't have terror. There's no kitten ever, experiencing terror in its mother's mouth. It's just happy. Okay, where are we going now, Mom? That's the analogy. So that's how the chapter ends. The last verse really summarizes it for us, and I'll share that one as well. As always in Bhagavad Gita, these concluding verses, first and last verses of the chapter, are very, very relevant. They're not random. Krishna says, Vedeshu yajneshu tapassu chaiva daneshu yat punya palang pradishtam atyeti tat sarvamidam viditva yogi parang sthanam upaiti charyam. A person who accepts the path of devotional service is not bereft of the results derived from studying the Vedas, performing sacrifices, undergoing austerities, giving charity, or pursuing philosophical and fruitive activities. Simply by performing devotional service, they attain all these, and at the end, they reach the supreme eternal abode. Right? So, in scripture, in spiritual traditions, there are many different paths. We've heard a little bit about them in the 4th chapter, about how there are different types of yagyas, If you're intellectually inclined, you'd do a lot of study yagya. And if you want to work with your hands and body, you'll do a lot of activity, and you'll offer that up in service. There's a lot of things you can do. But all the different results you can get by being generous and charitable, all the results you can get by studying scripture, by developing your knowledge, performing sacrifices, being austere, controlling the senses, those are all contained and included in the results you get from bhakti. It's not actually a separate path. You get everything. It's one-stop shopping spiritually. You're doing everything you need to. In bhakti, we have some austerities. We have the austerities that Krishna asks us to undergo. We avoid eating certain things that'll degrade our consciousness. We avoid doing certain things that'll degrade our consciousness, that aren't pleasing to Krishna and get in the way of our relationship with him. Those are austerities, because we could just be doing those things and not have to control ourselves. We don't have to invent any more austerities. Devotees naturally become generous. They naturally become truthful. They naturally care about the well-being of others. They're compassionate. They do good for others. all these subsidiary and secondary things are included in bhakti. And the results one gets from bhakti, therefore, they include all these other results. Just like Krishna is saying, if you're successful in bhakti, you don't have to worry about when you die, how you die, where you die. You just leave your body in relationship with me the same way you lived, in relationship with me. So there is no other need to practice something separate. There's nothing else that actually independently makes bhakti more powerful. It's not like, oh, I'll do some bhakti, but to really get an edge, like I'm going to read these other books that aren't about bhakti, and that'll make me like a better devotee. No, it won't. It won't actually get you a better destination, because the path of bhakti, again, comes down to receiving support from the highest power, from the most well-wishing friend. Does that make sense? Any comments or questions on our 8th chapter? We just finished the 8th chapter. Anything that stood out last few verses before we move on? Okay. All right, then, chapter 9. Chapter 9 is called the most confidential knowledge. So you have like confidential, more confidential, and most confidential. This is like that most middle aspect of the Bhagavad Gita. First verse, Krishna says, "My dear Arjuna, because you are never envious of me, I shall impart to you this most confidential knowledge." This came up earlier. This came up in the 4th chapter. Krishna actually said to Arjuna, because you're not envious of me, because you're my friend and my devotee. Bhaktosi me sakha cheti rahasyam yetit uttamam. This is chapter 4, verse 4, I think. 3 or 4. 4. Krishna says, I'm explaining the science to you because you're my devotee and my friend. So he's reiterating here, you're not envious. You're not approaching me to get something from me for yourself, separate from me. I know your heart, you're my devotee, you're my friend. You're not trying to gain me. You're not trying to like, I gave the analogy last week of, or was it the week before, chapter 7, about like demigod worship means just like you have the aspiration to be a successful CEO. So you'll join that company and you'll like read all the magazines and you want to be that person. You want to have everything they have. You want it for yourself. That's not bhakti. That's not love. That's just like business deal, right? You just want what they have. So Arjuna's he's not coming to Krishna like that. He's not envious. So Krishna's going to really open up in this chapter. And then Krishna talks a little bit about what this knowledge looks like, what it feels like to practice bhakti in the 2nd verse. Verse 2. Raj vidya raj guhyam pavitram idam uttamam pratyaksha dharmyam susukham kartam avyayam. This knowledge, i.e. knowledge of Krishna personally, is the king of education, the most secret of all secrets. It is the purest knowledge, and because it gives direct perception of the self by realization, it is the perfection of religion. It is everlasting and it is joyfully performed. All right, so some points here. That when one realizes Krishna, they can see themselves. When one sees Krishna, the source, they can see themselves. It's described in the Srimad Bhagavatam that just like if you're looking into a mirror and you decorate your face in the mirror with makeup or ornaments, you put on jewelry, you make your hair up, the reflection, does it stay plain or does it get decorated too? It's always going to get decorated, right? Prahlad Maharaj, a great devotee, says, if you look in the mirror and you decorate your own self, your reflection also gets decorated. It has to. Similarly, if you see the Supreme Lord, you will see yourself. Just like when the sun rises in the morning, if we leave the cities, get out of this artificial light atmosphere, when the sun rises, you see the sun, what happens? You see everything. You see the world, you see your surroundings, you see your own body, you see everything and everyone because the sun rises. So Krishna is like the sun. As soon as you see him, you see everything. That's why this verse says, it gives direct perception of the self. Practice of bhakti allows you to experience your own self. A lot of people come to bhakti or to spiritual life because they want to know who they are. And that's included. If you approach the Supreme, you will know who you are. Just like if you're in darkness, you should wait for the sun to rise and get out there. Don't stay inside. Turn on the lights, get outside your house, go where the sun is, you'll see yourself. It's natural. You can't help but do that. It's included. And the other point I wanted to bring out here is that it's joyfully performed. Susukham. Susukham means very happy. It is very happily performed. Unlike trying to control the senses independent of any connection with the Supreme Person, austerities for their own sake, just to control their mind, independent of any relationship, independent of any feeling for the divine. That's not joyful. Bhakti is actually quite joyful. It's natural. So continuing, the chapter goes on. Now, Krishna says in the 4th verse, by me in my unmanifested form, this entire universe is pervaded. All beings are in me, but I'm not in them. This is a classic verse, so I'll share the Sanskrit. Maya titamidam sarvam jagat avyaktamurtina matstani sarvabhutani nachaham tirshvavastitah. So the idea is that you have the universe and it's being pervaded by him in his unmanifest form, right? That you can't see, but he's actually pervading everything, right? One of our previous acharyas, he explains that the presence of the divine in every molecule, the atom, the atomic unit, was described in Sanskrit literature. The atomic indivisible unit was described long before 19th, 20th century modern science. And Jiva Goswami says that every atom of reality exists only because the supersoul is within it. That allows it to exist. That's what it means to have everything pervaded by the existence of the Supreme. Matter cannot independently be. It's there, it exists, it has reality, because the Supreme is allowing it to exist. It's within it. And yet in the next verse, Krishna, he apparently contradicts himself. He says, first, that I'm within everything. And then he says in verse 5, Natchamatstani bhutani pasha me yogam aishvaram. Bhuta brinnacha bhuta sto mamatma bhuta bhavanaha. And yet, everything that is created does not rest in me. Behold my mystic opulence. In other words, look at the contradiction in this. Although I am the maintainer of all living entities, and although I'm everywhere, I, myself, am not a part of this cosmic manifestation. For myself is the very source of creation. He's saying, on the one hand, everything you can experience in this world is coming from me. That's why he said earlier, if you taste your water and you think of this is Krishna, this manifesting from Krishna, that's correct. And at the same time, he's saying, it's not me. Because his personal existence, his intimate personal existence is not wrapped up in that bottle of water, or the molecules of this room, or the sunrise or sunset. These are all energies coming from him. This is what's known in Sanskrit as achintya bheda abheda tattva. It's a very fancy term. I can type it into chat if you really want it. You'll see it in the purports of this section. Achintya bheda abheda tattva. Simultaneous oneness and difference. The Supreme Lord is simultaneously the only source of everything, and he is completely independent from everything. That's how it is that there can be a world that is dependent on a source, and yet we can't see that source with our own eyes, unless he wants to be seen, as he is, in his most personal form, until he wants to reveal himself. Does that make sense? So he's saying this whole world comes from me, I'm pervading everything, but my personal self is beyond this. Just like we heard about in the last chapter, the material world is coming and going, but beyond that, there's a spiritual world. It's unmanifest, it doesn't end. And can you go to Walmart and buy yourself like a grocery bag full of the spiritual world? You can't buy it. You can't make it yours. You can't see it with your senses if the senses aren't purified through transcendental processes. And yet Krishna is saying it exists. Similarly, his body, his self, exists independent from the material world, although that same material world is just one of his energies. And so this chapter is going to deal with that personal self. And in verse 6, he gives a little bit of an analogy to elaborate on this oneness and difference. He says, Yatha kashastito nityam vayu sarvatra go mahan tata sarvani bhutani matstani tupadharya. Understand that As the mighty wind blowing everywhere rests always in the sky, all created beings rest in me. Right? He's saying you have the space around the planet, and sometimes the wind is in there and sometimes it's not. Sometimes the wind is moving and sometimes you don't feel the wind, but the wind is always resting in that space. Similarly, all living beings are resting in the Supreme. It's the substance, it's the foundation. Krishna himself is the substance or foundation for all of us doing our thing here in the sandbox of the material world. So he continues. Understand it as the mighty wind blowing, read that. O son of Kunti, at the end of the millennium, that's the lifetime of Brahma, all material manifestations enter into my nature, and at the beginning of another, by my potency, I create them again. And the idea is that Krishna, the source, he's presenting himself as the source and also the resting place, that from which everything emanates, and that into which everything descends or takes rest, right? This whole cosmic order is under me, verse 8. Under my will, it is automatically manifested again and again, and under my will, it is annihilated again and again. And then he says, but although this work is going on, it cannot bind me. I'm detached from these material activities, seated as though neutral. And verse 10, another classic verse. Myathyakshena prakriti suyate sacharacharam hetunanena kaunteya jagadvi parivartate. This material nature, which is one of my energies, is working under my direction, O son of Kunti, O Arjuna, producing all moving and non-moving beings. Under its rule, this manifestation is created and annihilated again and again. Right, so sometimes there's this question of like, where do things come from? And some people will answer, well, nature. It comes from nature. And so Prabhupada's response to that, the bhakti response to that is, whose nature? Whose nature? It's a fact that there is like a machinery going on. Like there's a cycle of seasons. There is a cycle to the planets orbiting around the sun. Things are moving. There's a coming and going. Things are born, they grow, they maintain, they produce offspring or byproducts, they dwindle and die. And that's going on again and again and again. In Sanskrit, that's called Kala Chakra, the wheel of time. But Krishna is saying, I put that wheel in motion. So just like a potter's wheel can be going on, and because of that, you can get pottery, but it cannot be started and it cannot be actually directed without the potter's hand. There has to be will behind it. There's intelligence behind it. It's not that it's happening whimsically. It's happening randomly. There is the functions of nature with all of its different periods and cycles, and there's a will behind all of that sets it into motion. The material energy alone, these cycles, they're not the cause. We didn't manifest ourselves. We didn't come from matter. The conscious self, all the conscious living entities didn't come from inanimate matter. This is directly in contradiction to the idea that consciousness can derive itself somehow magically from some combination of chemicals that one day realized that they were a person. No, that's not what Bhagavad Gita is saying. Bhagavad Gita is saying, you didn't come from matter, although you're living in a material body. Everything, including matter, is being directed by me, Krishna says about himself. I am the Adhyaksha, I am the superintendent, the overseer of all of that. Okay, any questions so far in this 9th chapter? Before we move on, this is a lot. There's already 10 verses we've done here. Let's take a pause here. Anything that stood out from these first few verses of the 9th chapter? You can refer to your notes or anything that you have questions about. Curious?
Caitlin has a question.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Something that I've been wrestling with is how Prabhupada's translation talks about time, and how, in my material understanding of time, is it important for me to understand when Krishna talks about a millennium, like, do I think about that in my devotional practice? I'm going to go with no, but it's something that I think my mind comes in and says, there's this essence of this, as you just mentioned, like the cycles of the planets and the seasons. So there is this constant movement. And is that basically more of the focus than the aspect of time?
Yeah, so just to kind of make sure I understand your question or your comment what I'm hearing is that there are a lot of there's a lot of specific information in Bhagavad Gita about like the periods of time, and there's also the general principle of the fact that there are periods of time, and things are coming and going. And so what I'm hearing is you're basically asking, is it necessary for you as a practitioner to know what all the periods of time are and how long they are and everything like that? Or is the point to just understand that the material world is coming and going and there are cycles of time within that? And therefore, we also have been coming and going, and to just generally apply that to our worldview. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. I see you now. Great.
Yeah.
Yes. So you're correct, basically. It's not necessary to know all the details. However, like any good teacher, Krishna provides, I wouldn't even say all the details here. This is like really a blueprint, because if you look in the Bhagavatam, in terms of the manifestation of the material worlds, cantos 2 and 3, and then again, from a different perspective, canto 5 deal with it in like much more detail. And it's more than almost anybody could ask for. But in Bhagavad Gita, he summarizes it. And even that can be like, well, do I have to memorize that, Brahma's life is 311 trillion solar years or earth years, and his day is 4.32 billion years, and so is his night? No, that's not going to change your relationship with Krishna. Not really. What may change your relationship with Krishna is to understand that time is relative, right? Like Brahma is the most advanced material being in the galaxy. He's the first created being. He's the primary demigod. And so for him, what seems like a really long time for us is like insignificant. How do we understand that? Look at insects. There are some kinds of insects, they're born, they partner up, they like fall in insect love, have a bunch of kids, die in the space of one night, right? 6 hours, their entire lifespan. You can just like have a 6-hour conversation. They've had their entire life done, right? So it's like, if you look at their life, it seems so fast. So if Brahma's looking at us, our lives seem like super, super firefly fast, right? It may be relevant to think that, okay, I don't know all the math, but I can see that time is relative, and that there are all these cycles, and ultimately we're all connected to the Supreme. And he's so magnificent and amazing that he's organizing all of this with his amazing intelligence. And if I wanted to know more, I can dive into it. That's enough. That's enough for your bhakti right there. That can inspire appreciation, humility. It can even inspire you to take your life seriously and start practicing in whatever time you do have. That's good. The rest is bonus. Like some people have a kind of mind where they want to know these things. They want to like nerd out over all that. Cool. For them, they can go into more of the detail. Other people, they don't need to. And so they don't have to. But Bhagavad Gita is basically essential knowledge. So when we're going through Bhagavad Gita, like the basic principles of, yeah, there is cyclical time. That's enough to pick up. And when you're reading, like when you're reading Bhagavatam, when you come to stuff that has more detail, just receive it. Even if you can't memorize it, even if you don't understand it all, that's okay. It's purifying just to receive it, and that's good enough, because it's also a transcendental vibration. Good? All right.
Okay.
Yeah. And as an aside, in these texts like Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, the reason that they periodically bring up our connection with the material world, or what the material world is and how it connects to the Supreme, instead of like, just talking about Krishna dancing around in Vrindavan, playing the flute and like that, and his form, is because our default setting is that we're attached to the material world. we, by default, because of our false egos, because of our lifetime after lifetime of being here and trying to be in control and enjoying things, we think this place is meant for our pleasure. And we act that way. And so it's necessary for the advancing devotee to become detached from that and attached to Krishna. You get attached to Krishna by hearing about him. You get detached from the world by hearing about it in relationship to him. That it's not mine. It doesn't belong to me. It's actually this gigantic, perfectly organized machinery for giving me an opportunity to choose over and over again between him and selfishness. And when you hear about that, you can become like mature and detached from, oh yeah, like what am I doing? Trying to like win in this world and like look good or play these little ego trip games. And you can kind of like
Hi,
stop.
excuse me, Shamya. Hi, I'm sorry. I just wanted to interject there, if I
Sure.
could. And hi everyone. Sorry, I just came up for air. I was just thinking about I've been thinking about what you're saying. Like when you zoom out to the max and you see yourself as this small little tiny thing that's walking around, you know, for like 100 years out of this massive situation that we have that's been around for millennia. How like what are like, it really kind of makes you think like, okay, you could see it as, all right, we're small like ants, we're just gonna get squashed and then we're done, or like what am I doing right now that is serving this bigger picture that we're talking about? But it really is, it's kind of hard to reconcile, you know, the being what we are, seeing it in the, you know, the macro and the micro, I guess.
Yeah, that's why it's important.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
No problem. It is hard to reconcile the macro and the micro. And the solution is that's what we have to hear about, both of them in terms of their connection to Krishna. There are a lot of great thinkers who realize that, you know, we're just here for like an insignificant amount of time. And from the perspective of the universe, nothing we do really matters, apparently. And what does that breed but just a bunch of depression and purposelessness? Because that in and of itself is not connected to Krishna. That's just seeing the scope of the universe, but not seeing Krishna. When one becomes Krishna conscious, they'll see how he's manifested a world with enormity, with gigantic scale, and he is personally attending to every single living entity's needs all the time, material and spiritual. And that doesn't create depression. It doesn't create meaninglessness, worthlessness. Quite the opposite. It breeds humility, amazement, love, eventually. And it also, in the meantime, helps detach us from our little petty dramas in this world, which don't really matter, right? And brings us closer to Krishna. Yeah. Thank you. Any other reflections on the first 10 verses of the 9th chapter before we continue? We have a little bit of time. We'll probably get another couple of verses in. Okay. Great. So then we read verse 10. That he's a superintendent of the material energy. Then he says in verse 11, Avajananti mamuta manushim tanam ashtam bharam bhava majananto amabhuta maheshwaram. Fools deride me when I descend in the human form. They don't know my transcendental nature as the supreme lord of all that be. Right? He's saying here that he has been saying that he's the source of the material world. And then he's saying, but when I show up as I am, those who don't really know me, they overlook me. Right? It's like if you're living in a prison and the warden walks in, you may think that's just another prisoner. You have no idea like what their life is. You have no idea that they're in charge of the place. You know, if you are in a hospital and like you're not quite well, then the whatever administrator of the hospital can walk in and you could think they're just like an orderly or like one of you, another patient. Now Krishna is giving us that it's not automatic that you can recognize that everything is coming from the source or that you can see him. You know, sometimes people say, like, I want to see God. And Srila Prabhupada in response to that is, well, what is your qualification for seeing God? If he revealed himself to you, would you have the eyes to see him? Would you actually be qualified to recognize him? And what would it mean, to say you could see God? And then Krishna goes on, the 13th and 14th verses, to talk about the qualities of those who can understand him. This is important for us. The qualities of those who are able to understand him. 9:13. Mahatmanas tumam partha daivim prakrutim ashrita bhajanti manaso nyatva bhutadim avyayam. O son of Pritha, O Arjuna, those who are not deluded, the great souls, are under the protection of the divine nature. They are fully engaged in devotional service because they know me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, original and inexhaustible. He's describing how those who become convinced that there is a Supreme Person, they take shelter of bhakti. And that's this supreme energy he's talking about. And by that, they can come to know him. And he gives their symptoms in the next verse, verse 14. Satatan kirtayanto mam gitantascha dhritavrita namasyantascha mam bhaktya nitya yukta upasate. Always chanting my glories, endeavoring with great determination, bowing down before me, these great souls perpetually worship me with devotion. So these are the symptoms of somebody who's actually spiritually advanced, who's actually wise. They choose to use their body, their mind, their words, their energy, their time, their wealth, their heart, in relationship to the Supreme. In fact, the verse begins, Satatam kirtayanta. What does that word remind you of, kirtaya?
Kirtan.
Kirtan. Yeah, it's the same Sanskrit word, to glorify, to sing, to glorify. Always glorifying me, always singing about me. This is a quality of a spiritually advanced person. This is, again, a non-sectarian principle. In any tradition you find, anybody who's actually advancing wants to talk about the Supreme. They want to hear about the Supreme. They're not so interested in tuning into CNN to see who started what war with which country today for the 95th billionth time. They're not as interested in all the details of the comings and goings of the material world. They're more interested in the activities of the Supreme. That interests them. They're interested in the kirtan. They find the names of the Supreme attractive. Satatang, he says, constantly chanting. Again, we talked about constantly, what that means. Our previous teachers explained that means at the highest level, literally constantly, like one is always chanting with their mouth or their mind. And for the practitioner, it means at least they have a daily practice. Because everything that we care about, we do daily, right? Do you all eat every day? I'm a big fan of eating every day. Really, really big fan of that. I like eating, so I do it every day. And I like sleeping. I sleep every day. I like spending time with my loved ones. I like getting some exercise, some recreation, doing some work. Everything I care about, I do every day. And so also, if one has a daily practice, that signals seriousness to Krishna, and it also attracts his mercy. That's also constantly chanting, as we talked about. So these are the qualifications for actually being able to see the Supreme. Krishna was on the planet 5,000 years ago talking to Arjuna. Did everybody who look at him think, oh, wow, that's the Supreme Personality of Godhead? No, they didn't. They didn't necessarily have the qualification to. He didn't have this conversation with everybody. They weren't all Arjuna. They didn't all have the eyes to see. But at the same time, everyone can have the potential to see. That's why Bhagavad Gita, after all, is broadcast. It's not just, okay, Arjuna got to hear that. Tough luck for everyone else forever. Too bad. Sucks to be you. No, it's like we are intimately connected with Krishna, and we can choose to turn our attention to him. We can choose to kirtaya, to practice kirtan, to chant, to put our attention there. We can choose to qualify ourselves so we can actually see him in this life. Or we can choose not to, or we can kind of choose both at the same time, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. We have that opportunity. And so these qualifications, these symptoms of the devotee are given. And that's important because we want to be able to tell in our own lives if we're advancing. And we want to be able to tell who we should be taking shelter of as senior, more advanced devotees. On one level, it's good to recognize all aspiring devotees as devotees and honor them. On another level, it's also good to see, well, actually, that person, they're actually doing what the scripture says someone would do if they're more advanced. They're actually living in accordance with how Krishna says somebody who's advancing would live. They're actually like in harmony with that. They're in integrity with that. And I'm also seeing in my life that as I practice, I'm increasing, my attachment to hearing and chanting, for example. These metrics are useful for that. They're not useful for thinking we're better than other people. They're not useful for useless, petty, or materialistic discrimination. But there is such a thing as spiritual discrimination, right? There has to be. Otherwise, we could say that, following the wisdom of Bhagavad Gita is as good as reading a choose your own adventure book, or, like any like made for TV movie. They're all equally valid because they're all perspectives on reality. No, there are symptoms of wisdom, and Bhagavad Gita is giving them periodically so we can assess in ourselves and in our guides and gurus and in our community, use spiritual discrimination to see, like, am I advancing? Am I properly aligned? Am I following those who are more advanced than me? Things like that. So I think I'll pause there. This is a natural kind of pause point, the 14th verse of the 9th chapter. Yeah. Shri Bhagavad Gita, Ki Jai, chapter 9, Ki Jai. Now we can take any more comments, questions, or reflections. We'll take at least a couple, just anything that stood out about this chapter or the end of the 8th chapter. And for those listening at home, please read from the end of to the end of the 8th chapter of Bhagavad Gita and the first 14 texts of chapter 9. And then as soon as you have any realization or comment or question, post it in the WhatsApp. It's very enlivening for all of us. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Let's get a couple of reflections. To be fair, we already had a couple. Let's get at least one more.
I have one.
Yes.
So
yeah.
I always really love the sun. So when one realizes Krishna, they can see themselves. And Krishna is like the sun. So
Yeah. When one realizes Krishna, they can realize themselves, just like when the sun rises and you can see yourself. There's this kind of like magical thing that happens when the sun rises and the world kind of gets a whole bunch of more potential. And then when the sun goes down, it's like, oh, well, I guess that's it for the day. May as well just go to sleep. Nothing else to see here, right? And there's that way, and it's like a little slice of, like, we can see how dependent we are on higher powers. That without light, we're like, oh, all right, whatever. And so similarly, when we become Krishna conscious, we become aware of our own self. Yeah. Whereas the attempt to kind of figure ourselves out doesn't work. Like if you try to light up darkness without a proper light source, darkness can't light itself, right? We're already in darkness. We can't, if we weren't in darkness, we wouldn't need Krishna. So we need that sun. We need that external source of perfect light and heat. Thank you. Anything else?
Amy would like to make a comment.
Hi, Amy.
We are in a partnership with Krishna. He takes our hand and we sing with Krishna.
Yeah, we're in a partnership. Yeah, that was in relationship to around the point of how, the yogis in previous ages are in the external process, the not, purely devotional process of yoga. They would advance under their own power. And the devotee doesn't advance under their own power. Our power, our endeavor means something. It means something. We're not literally doing nothing, but Krishna is doing the heavy lifting. And what we're really doing is like letting him do that, receiving that and choosing him over and over again, So yeah, we're in a partnership and we're supported. We're not alone in our practice. Thank you. Beautiful. All right, amazing. I think we did it. We got halfway through chapter 9. My actual literal favorite chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. And the second half of the chapter is where Krishna starts to open up even more. Feel free, after you've read the first 14 verses, to read ahead. No, there's no rule says you can't. They're really good verses. You can read them over and over again. Anything else before we wrap it up for today? October
I'll
3rd.
I have
Yeah.
one comment. I don't know if
Please.
it was Radhika Das or it was somebody on Instagram posted something, and it comes from like my Christian background. There's like a
Okay.
poem called Footprints, and he
Yeah.
quoted it. And I just, again, when you talk about, when Amy just commented about partnership and we're not alone, and like how we can't go this alone. And the Footprints poem that he quoted was just very, very quickly summarized by saying, like, there's two sets of footprints walking down the beach. And then the person was like, during the hardest times, I only saw one set of footprints, God, where were you? And when God looks and he says, yeah, I was walking alongside you with the two sets of footprints. But in those hard times, I actually carried you, and those footprints were mine. And I think that is just like such a beautiful imagery. Like, if we have to kind of like visualize it, that kind of really speaks to what you were saying about that partnership and that leaning on Krishna, and that we can't do it alone.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'm familiar with that poem. That's the sentiment. That's the same idea. Yeah, we're not trying to do it alone, and we can't. Yeah. Jai. All right. Bhagavad Gita Sangha Ki Jai, Chapter 9 Ki Jai. We'll see you next week for hopefully the rest of the 9th chapter. And until then, see you on WhatsApp and the pages of Bhagavad Gita. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Bye for now.
Mhm.